When I accidentally knocked over my husband's bag, a bright red lipstick fell out. I never wear that color. I said nothing. I just wrote on the bathroom mirror, "Divorce," and left to my friend's place. That evening, there were 17 missed calls. Good day, dear listeners. It's Briella again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to think that 42 years of marriage was something solid, something you could lean against, the way you lean against a wall, not even thinking about it, just trusting that it will hold you. Frank and I had built that wall together, brick by brick, through 3 kids, 2 cross-country moves, 1 miscarriage we never fully talked about, and more ordinary Tuesdays than I could count. Our house in Maplewood, New Jersey, the white colonial with the crooked mailbox Frank always meant to fix, was paid off. Our youngest daughter, Rachel, had just given us our 2nd grandchild. By every measure I knew how to use, my life was complete. I was 64 years old. I baked sourdough on Fridays. I volunteered at the public library on Wednesday afternoons. I had a book club, a garden that needed more attention than I gave it, and a husband who kissed me on the cheek every morning before he left for the office. Frank was 67, semi-retired from the engineering firm he'd worked at for 30 years, but he'd taken on what he called consulting work, a few projects here and there to keep himself busy. I thought that was healthy. I was glad he had purpose. I never thought to look closer. The first signal came so quietly, I almost didn't hear it. It was late February, a Thursday. Frank came home later than usual, not dramatically late, maybe 40 minutes. And when I asked where he'd been, he said, "Traffic on Route 9, in the tone people use when they've already prepared the answer. I didn't press. Why would I? We'd been married 42 years. But later, clearing the dinner table, I noticed he'd barely touched his food, and Frank had always had the appetite of a man 20 years younger. He said he wasn't feeling well. He went to bed early. I stood in the kitchen for a long moment, holding his half-full plate over the trash can. Something small and cold moved through me, like a draft under a closed door. I threw the food away and told myself I was imagining things, but the signals kept coming, small and regular as drops from a leaky faucet. His cell phone, which used to sit on the kitchen counter charging overnight, had migrated to the nightstand on his side of the bed. He'd started taking it into the bathroom. Once, when it buzzed at dinner and I glanced over reflexively, he turned it face down in a motion so fast and smooth it felt practiced. He laughed and said it was just his buddy Dave from the firm, always texting about golf. I nodded and passed the salad. He began coming home smelling different. Not perfume exactly, nothing so obvious. More like he'd been somewhere that had a particular air to it. Something clean and synthetic, like a newer building, an apartment maybe, with fresh carpet and plug-in air fresheners. I know that smell. Rachel had it in her first place. He bought new shirts. Frank had worn the same brand of Oxford button-down since the early 90s. Suddenly, there were slim-cut things in the closet, colors he'd never worn. Sage, dusty blue. I asked about them once. He said a colleague had convinced him to try something different. He was 67 years old and updating his wardrobe for a colleague. I started watching, not frantically. I want to be honest about that. I watched the way you watch a stain on the ceiling after a heavy rain, wondering if it's spreading. Then came the morning that changed everything. It was a Saturday in mid-March. Frank had gone out to get the car washed, another new habit. The man had let that Buick go gray with road salt every winter for a decade, and he'd left his brown leather messenger bag hanging on the hook by the back door. I wasn't snooping. I want to be clear about that, too. I was carrying a load of recycling to the bin in the garage, and I misjudged the space in the narrow hallway. My elbow caught the strap. The bag swung, tipped, and fell open. I watched it happen almost slowly, the way accidents happen in that strange, suspended moment before the sound arrives. The bag hit the floor and its contents spilled out. His reading glasses in the soft case, a folded receipt, his spare car key, a chapstick he'd had for years, and a lipstick, bright red. The kind of red that makes no attempt to be subtle. A small, gold-capped tube of Revlon Super Lustrous in a shade that could only be called fire engine red. It rolled 2 inches across our kitchen floor tile and stopped. I didn't wear red lipstick. I hadn't worn any lipstick at all in months. I stood there with my arms full of newspapers and cardboard, looking down at that small red cylinder, and I felt the wall I'd been leaning against for 42 years, quietly, completely, give way. I put down the recycling. I picked up the lipstick. I held it for a moment. It was waxy and cold, like a fact. Then I put it back exactly where it had fallen. I gathered up his bag and hung it back on the hook the way it had been. And I went upstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed, our bed, the same queen-sized mattress we'd bought in 1998 after our old one finally gave. And I did not cry. I noticed that about myself. I'd always imagined that if something like this ever happened, I would cry. Fall apart, maybe. Call one of my daughters in a panic. But I just sat there with my hands folded in my lap, very still, while the heat came on and ticked through the radiators, and I looked at the framed photo on the dresser. Frank and me at Rachel's wedding, 5 years ago. He had his arm around me. We were both laughing at something someone off camera had just said. I had no idea what. I began to take inventory. Not of feelings. Feelings could wait. I mean a real inventory, the kind you do when you're trying to understand the dimensions of a problem. The house was in both our names. I knew that because I'd signed the deed myself in 1989 in a lawyer's office in Cranford with bad air conditioning. Our savings account was joint, the account we'd been depositing into since Frank's first real salary, the one that now held just over $230,000, plus the CDs we'd rolled over twice. There was Frank's pension from the firm, which had vested fully at his 30-year mark. And there was the consulting income, the new work. I realized I had never, not once, seen a pay stub or a client contract. He'd mentioned figures occasionally, vaguely. I had let it go. I was a woman who had managed this household for 42 years. I had raised 3 children, maintained the finances when Frank traveled, negotiated with contractors, kept files on every appliance warranty we'd ever owned. I was not helpless, but I had been, I could see it now, sitting on that bed. I had been deliberately kept at a comfortable distance from certain things, and I had allowed it because I trusted him. That trust was lying on the kitchen floor in the shape of a red lipstick tube. Fear came then. A specific, practical fear. Not a dramatic one. What if he'd already moved money? What if the consulting work was being deposited somewhere I didn't have access to? What if he'd been planning this, quietly, patiently, while I baked bread on Fridays and thought our wall was solid? I was 64 years old. I had a part-time library volunteer role and a book club. I had not held a full-time job since our son Michael was born in 1983. My Social Security, when I took it, would be a fraction of Frank's. A divorce, if it came to that, would not leave me destitute. I knew enough to know that New Jersey was an equitable distribution state, and 42 years of marriage meant something in family court. But equitable did not mean equal, and getting what I was entitled to would require me to know what existed, where it was, and how to prove it. I made a decision, not a hysterical one, a quiet, deliberate one, the same way I decided anything I was serious about. I would not confront Frank. Not yet. Not until I knew exactly what I was dealing with. But I needed to tell him something. I needed him to understand that the ground had shifted, without revealing that I had already started calculating. So that evening, while Frank was in the garage fiddling with something, I went into the bathroom. I found a lipstick of my own, an old rose pink one, barely used, and I wrote on the mirror in slow, even capital letters, "Divorce." Then I took my overnight bag, already half-packed from a trip to see Rachel last month, and I drove to my friend Carol's house 4 miles away. My phone rang 17 times before I turned it on silent. At Carol's kitchen table, over tea I didn't taste, I told her everything. Carol had been my friend for 30 years. She'd been through her own divorce in 2011, a nasty one, and she'd come out the other side intact and sharp. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always loved about her. When I finished, she said, "Dorothy, first thing tomorrow morning, you call a family law attorney. Not Frank's kind of people. A good one. Someone who will sit across from you and tell you the truth." She gave me the name of the woman who had handled her case, Ellen Marsh in Summit. She said Ellen was the kind of lawyer who didn't panic and didn't lose. I wrote the name down on a paper napkin and folded it into my wallet. That night, lying in Carol's guest room under a quilt I'd helped her pick out at a tag sale in 2015, I stared at the ceiling and began building my plan. Not revenge. I want to be honest about that. I wasn't interested in burning anything down. I was interested in something much colder and more precise. I was interested in not losing what was mine. The first piece of the plan was Ellen Marsh. The second piece was documentation. I had 48 hours before Frank's confusion would turn to calculation. I intended to use them. I was up before Carol. I made coffee in her kitchen at 6:15, watching the early March light come flat and gray through her window over the sink, and I sat with my paper napkin unfolded on the table in front of me. Ellen Marsh. I had already looked her up on my phone the night before. 14 years in family law, a partner at her firm, a photograph on the website that showed a woman about my age with reading glasses pushed up on her head and an expression that suggested she'd heard everything twice. I had called at 8 sharp and left a message with her assistant asking for the earliest available appointment. Ellen called back herself at 8:47. I respected that. We met that same afternoon in her office in Summit. Clean, practical space, not the kind designed to intimidate, which I also respected. I sat across from her desk and I told her everything I've told you. The new shirts, the phone face down, the smell of a different apartment, and the red lipstick rolling across my kitchen floor. Ellen listened with her pen in her hand but rarely wrote anything down, which told me she was actually listening. When I finished, she asked me 3 questions. Did I have access to our joint financial accounts? Yes. Did I know the name of Frank's pension administrator? Yes. It was through his firm's HR, I had the contact in an old tax file at home. Was there anything I suspected had been transferred, hidden, or moved in the last 12 months? That last question sat in my chest for a moment. I don't know, I said. That's part of what worries me. Ellen nodded. She told me the first priority, before anything else, before any conversation with Frank, before any formal filing, was a complete and accurate financial picture. She explained that in New Jersey, once divorce proceedings began, there were automatic temporary restraining orders on marital assets, meaning neither party could hide or liquidate without court consequences. But the protection only worked if we knew what we were protecting. She wanted me to go home, access our online banking, and download statements for the last 24 months. Pull the most recent tax returns, locate the pension documents, and photograph anything relevant before Frank had any reason to think I was gathering information. You wrote divorce on the mirror, she said. That gives him a warning. Some people tidy up their finances fast when they get a warning. I told her I understood. I told her I'd be back in that house that afternoon. I drove to Maplewood directly from Ellen's office. Frank's car was gone. He often played golf on Monday afternoons, a habit that now took on a different texture. I had approximately 2 hours. I worked quickly. I downloaded 30 months of bank statements to a flash drive I'd bought at a CVS on the way home. I photographed the pension documents in the filing cabinet in Frank's office. I found 3 statements from a brokerage account I did know about, our joint investment account. But I also found, tucked behind the hanging files in the back of the second drawer, a single statement from a different institution, Vanguard, an individual account in Frank's name only. The most recent balance shown was $41,200. I photographed every page. My hands were steady. I noticed that in the same detached way I'd noticed not crying. I carried the flash drive and my phone back to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and stood at the counter looking at the bathroom door down the hall. The mirror. My words still written there in rose-pink lipstick, because Frank, apparently, had not wiped it off. That told me something too. Then my phone rang. It was Frank. I answered. Dot. His voice had that careful, engineered quality I recognized from the few times over the years we'd had serious disagreements. The voice that wanted to sound calm because it was not. Where are you? I'm home, I said. A beat. You're home right now? Yes. Another beat, longer. I think we need to talk. I agree, I said, but not today. I need a few more days. He started to say something about how we should just sit down together, how whatever I was thinking wasn't what it looked like, how we'd been married 42 years. I let him say it. Then I told him calmly that I had spoken to an attorney and that he should probably do the same. The quality of silence on the other end of the line changed in a way I can only describe as a door closing. An attorney, he repeated. Yes. I heard him breathing. Then, Dot, you're overreacting. Frank, I said, and I was surprised by how level my voice came out. I found the lipstick. He said nothing. That silence was my first direct confirmation. Not an explanation. Not a denial. Just the silence of a man whose cover had finally, precisely, been removed. I told him I would be staying at Carol's for another few nights, and I hung up. I stood in my kitchen for a moment. Our kitchen, with its 42 years of accumulated ordinary life, and I felt the last, small, stubborn hope I hadn't known I was carrying quietly dissolve. What remained was not grief. Not yet. What remained was clarity. I put the flash drive in my purse, locked the front door behind me, and drove back to Carol's. There was no going back from what I now knew, and I found, to my own surprise, that I didn't want to go back. Ellen filed the divorce complaint the following Friday. By then, I had returned to the house. It was my house, too. And Ellen had been clear that leaving the marital home for an extended period could complicate things. So I moved back in on Wednesday, into the guest room down the hall from the bedroom Frank and I had shared. He was home when I arrived. We moved around each other in the kitchen like two people who had forgotten the choreography of the same room. He tried twice to start a conversation. I told him both times to speak through the attorneys. He didn't like that. His jaw did the thing it had always done when he felt outmaneuvered, a small forward thrust, almost imperceptible. I had spent 42 years learning every micro-expression on that face. I used them now like a field guide. The filing set things in motion quickly. On Monday, Ellen sent the formal notice to Frank's attorney, a man named Gerald Poole, who operated out of a large firm in Morristown and whose website featured a great deal of photography of boardrooms. This was telling. Gerald Poole was not a family law specialist. He was a business litigator. Frank had called in someone to protect assets, not to negotiate a fair settlement. That, too, was information. The automatic temporary restraining orders kicked in with the filing, which meant neither of us could touch the joint accounts without court permission. It was at this point, I later reconstructed the timeline, that Frank made his first serious mistake. He called his brother Dennis. Dennis Harris was 3 years younger than Frank and had, for the entire span of my marriage, been the person Frank called when he needed help doing something he didn't want me to know about. Dennis had helped Frank hide a car repair bill in 1994. He'd been involved in some private business investment in 2008 I'd never gotten the full story on. He was not a bad man, exactly, but he was loyal to Frank the way a dog is loyal, without judgment, without question. Dennis called me on a Tuesday evening. I almost didn't answer. Then I decided I wanted to hear what he'd been sent to say. "Dot," he said, in a voice that tried to land somewhere between concern and authority. "Frank is devastated. He loves you. Whatever you found, whatever you think is going on, this is 42 years. You have grandchildren. Don't do something you can't undo." I let him finish. Then I said, "Dennis, I've retained an attorney, and so has Frank. Any communication between us needs to go through them." I was polite. I was not cold, exactly. I simply declined to engage. He shifted then. The concerned tone dropped and something harder came through. He told me I was being vindictive, that I wanted to blow up the family over nothing, that if I pursued this, I would be left with a lot less than I thought, because Frank had options I wasn't aware of. There it was. I said, "Thank you for the call, Dennis," and I hung up. I forwarded a summary of the conversation to Ellen by email that night. She wrote back within an hour. "Document everything. That call may matter." 2 days later, something more direct happened. I came out of the library on Wednesday afternoon. It was my volunteer shift, and I had decided to keep every element of my normal routine, both for my own sanity and because disrupting routines signals vulnerability. And she was standing next to my car. I knew who she was immediately, though I had never seen her before. She was perhaps 35, blonde, in a wool coat that was too light for the weather. She was holding her keys with both hands in a way that looked either anxious or rehearsed. I couldn't tell which. Her name, I would confirm from phone records Ellen later subpoenaed, was Cindy Walters. She said my name. I stopped walking. "I think we should talk," she said. I looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had been in my marriage for however long, who had left her lipstick in my husband's bag. And I felt something that surprised me. Not hatred, not the flare of emotions I might have expected, but a very focused, very steady calm. "There's nothing I need from you," I said. She said Frank loved her. She said this was serious, that it had been serious for 2 years, and that the kindest thing I could do, for everyone, including myself, was to let go. She said the word gracefully, which I thought was interesting. I unlocked my car. I got in. I drove away. My hands were shaking slightly by the time I reached Carroll Street, and I gripped the wheel tighter until they stopped. Cindy Walters thought she was threatening me, or pleading with me, or perhaps both. What she had actually done was confirm, in person, the full scope of what I was dealing with, a structured, intentional affair, 2 years long, with a woman Frank had apparently convinced to serve as his emissary. I wrote down the time, the location, and everything she'd said in the Notes app on my phone before I went inside. That Friday, after Ellen confirmed everything was filed and the restraining orders were active, I took a weekend. I drove to Rachel's in Pennsylvania. I held my granddaughter. I ate Rachel's cooking. I told her only that Frank and I were going through something difficult and that I was handling it. She cried. I held her and said, "I'm all right, sweetheart. I promise I'm all right." And I was. For those 2 days, suspended in the ordinary warmth of my daughter's house, I was completely, quietly, all right. I came home from Rachel's on Sunday evening to find a handwritten letter on the kitchen counter. It was from Frank. 4 pages, his handwriting, the careful, slanted script he'd used since he was a boy in Catholic school, the same hand that had signed our marriage certificate. I stood in my coat at the kitchen counter and read all 4 pages. He said he was sorry. He said it more than once, in more than one way, and some of it sounded real. He said that what had happened with Cindy had been a mistake, a word I noticed he used rather than relationship or affair, and that he had ended it. He said that 42 years meant more than one mistake, that we had built too much together to let it end this way, that our children and grandchildren needed us whole. He said he had asked Gerald Poole to reach out to Ellen about exploring reconciliation options. I read the letter twice. Then I put it in a folder in my bag, because documents are documents, and Ellen would want to see it. Then I put the kettle on and thought carefully about what I actually felt. What I felt was not temptation, or rather, I felt it and I recognized it for what it was. The pull toward the familiar, the appeal of stepping back from a difficult and uncertain path onto a worn and known one. 42 years was not nothing. I was 64. The future suddenly felt very wide and very uncharted in a way that the last several weeks had kept me too busy to fully register. But I also felt, underneath that pull, something that had not been there before all this started. The memory of standing in my kitchen holding a red lipstick that was not mine, and the memory of the silence on the other end of the phone when I named it. That silence was not a mistake. That silence was a man calculating his next move. The kettle boiled. I made tea. On Monday, I called Ellen and told her about the letter. She said Gerald Poole had indeed reached out, proposing mediation as a first step. She said it was my choice, as it always would be, but that she wanted me to know. In New Jersey, marital assets were evaluated at their value on the date of complaint filing. The filing was done. The Vanguard account had been found. The picture was reasonably complete. Reconciliation was an option, she said, but it was not a legal strategy. It was a personal one. If you go back, she said carefully, you go back with full knowledge of the Vanguard account, the 2-year timeline, and the fact that his brother called you with what could be construed as financial intimidation. Make sure that's the person you want to go back to. I told her I understood. I told her to hold steady on the filing. That week, Frank stopped leaving letters and started being very quiet in the house. A different kind of quiet than the first week, less wounded, more watchful. I could feel him recalibrating. He began leaving for his consulting in the mornings again, though I noticed he was often back by noon. I said nothing. I maintained my routines with the precision of someone who knows they're being observed. Carol had, by this point, told 2 other friends, with my permission. Linda, who had gone through a late-life financial renegotiation with her ex-husband in 2018 and had very specific practical knowledge, and Meredith, who was an estate attorney by profession and my friend by 30 years of book club. I did not want a committee. I wanted 2 women who knew things I needed to know. The 4 of us met at Carol's on Thursday evening, with wine I didn't drink much of, and conversation I was wholly present for. Meredith confirmed what Ellen had said about equitable distribution and added that given the length of the marriage, my years as primary homemaker, and Frank's significantly higher earning history, I had a strong claim for a larger share. She also mentioned, delicately, that if Frank had made financial gifts or transfers to Cindy Walters during the marriage, those could potentially be reclaimed as marital assets in the settlement. That was something I had not considered. Linda was more practical. She told me to open a personal checking account in my own name immediately, fund it with whatever I was legally entitled to from our joint account, according to my agreement with Ellen, and begin establishing my individual credit history. I had a credit card in my own name from years ago, something I'd kept almost superstitiously through decades of joint accounts. Linda said that instinct had been a good one. I drove home from Carol's that night feeling something I hadn't expected to feel. Less alone. That is not nothing. When you are 64 years old and the life you thought you were living has turned out to have a room in it you weren't told about. Cindy Walters did not contact me again. Frank was quiet. Gerald Poole and Ellen exchanged formal correspondence. The machinery of it all moved in its slow, procedural way, and I kept steady inside it. I tended my garden. I went to book club. I baked sourdough on Friday because that had always been mine, not ours. I waited. It was a Saturday morning in April when they both came. I was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard 2 car doors. I looked out the window over the sink and watched Frank come up the front walk. And behind him, 1 step back, Dennis. Frank had his hands in his jacket pockets, the sage-colored jacket, one of the new ones. And Dennis had the particular forward-leaning posture of a man who believes he is about to solve a problem. I considered not answering the door. Then I decided that was wrong. Let them say what they'd come to say, in the house that still had my name on the deed, and say it to my face. I opened the door. Frank said he just wanted to talk. He looked tired in a real way, not a performed way. And for a moment, I felt the old reflex of concern. 42 years of noticing when he wasn't sleeping, And then I felt myself notice the reflex and set it down. "Come in," I said. We sat at the kitchen table, the three of us, the same table where Frank and I had eaten 30 years of meals, where the kids had done homework, where I'd made grocery lists and plans. Dennis immediately started talking, which confirmed he'd been sent as the moderator. He said this whole situation had gotten out of hand. He said Frank was truly sorry, that Cindy was out of the picture, completely, finally. He said the family was at stake, that the grandchildren would be confused and hurt. He said the word unnecessary several times, applied to the divorce proceedings, as though my response to being deceived for 2 years was the problem requiring justification. Then Frank spoke, and his tone was different from the letter. The letter had been private, and private Frank could afford to be wounded. This Frank, at this table, with Dennis beside him, was negotiating. He told me that if we proceeded with the divorce as filed, things would become very complicated. He said that the consulting work he'd been doing had been structured in a way that, he paused here, chose his words, was technically separate from our marital finances, and that untangling it in court would take a long time and cost both of us significantly. He said there was a better way. He said we could handle this privately, fairly, come to an agreement without putting everything through the courts. "What does privately mean?" I asked. Dennis jumped in. "It meant we sat down with a mediator, one of Frank's choosing," he said, though he didn't use exactly those words, "and worked out a settlement without a trial. He said it would be faster, less expensive, less painful for the kids. He said it so reasonably. I want to give him that. If I had been a woman in the first week of shock, sitting at this table with these two men who knew me and spoke in measured tones about the family and the grandchildren and keeping things private, I might have been moved. But I was not in the first week of shock. I had spent 6 weeks building a clear, documented picture of my own financial reality. I had an attorney who didn't panic and didn't lose. I had Carol and Linda and Meredith. And I had Ellen's voice in my ear from our last phone call. A private settlement proposed by the other party using their mediator on their timeline is not a settlement. It's a surrender dressed as a compromise. I looked at Frank across the table, really looked at him, the way I hadn't let myself do since the lipstick, because looking directly at 42 years is a different kind of work. "Frank," I said, "I have a very good attorney. If the consulting work was structured outside of marital assets, she'll find that out, and so will the court. If it wasn't, then it's part of the estate. Either way, the right place to sort it out is in front of a judge." Dennis opened his mouth. "I'm not done," I said, and Dennis closed it. "I understand you both came here to help. I understand that in your minds this looks like a reasonable offer. But I am not going to agree to a private settlement negotiated at my kitchen table with my soon-to-be ex-husband and his brother on a Saturday morning. You need to go now." Frank stood up slowly. His jaw did the thing. Dennis made one more attempt, something about how I would regret being so rigid. And I stood up too, which ended the conversation. They left. I locked the front door and stood with my back against it, and I felt it then. A fine, cold thread of fear running through me. The technically separate language. The private settlement pressure. The mediator of their choice. These were not the moves of a man who had nothing to hide. These were the moves of a man with something specific to protect. And if he had something specific to protect, I needed to find it. I was afraid, I won't pretend otherwise. But the fear didn't hollow me out, it sharpened me. I went to the kitchen, picked up my phone, and called Ellen. We need to look harder at the consulting income, I said. It took Ellen's forensic accountant 6 weeks. Her name was Paula Stroud, and she was the most thorough person I had ever watched work. She went through 3 years of tax returns, Frank's consulting contracts, and 2 LLC filings in Delaware, companies I had never heard of, entities that had existed on paper while I baked sourdough and tended my garden and believed I understood the shape of my own financial life. Here is what Paula found. Over 31 months, Frank had directed approximately $140,000 in consulting income into a limited liability company called HF Consulting LLC. The F for Frank, the H for Harris. That LLC had a business checking account. From that account, over the same period, he had made 44 transfers to a personal checking account held in the name of Cynthia Walters. The total transferred to Cindy Walters came to just under $62,000. Gifts from marital assets to a third party. In New Jersey family law, that has a name: dissipation of marital assets, and it has consequences. Ellen presented this to Gerald Poole in a formal letter 3 weeks before the hearing date. His response was to request an extension, which told us everything we needed to know about how prepared Frank's side was for what Paula had found. The extension was denied. The hearing was held on a Thursday in June in the Chancery Division courtroom in the Morris County Courthouse, a room with wood paneling that had darkened over decades and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look equally tired. I wore a gray blazer over a white blouse, clothes I had chosen carefully for their quality of projecting exactly nothing. I sat at the table beside Ellen and I breathed through my nose, and I watched Frank come in with Gerald Poole and take the seat across the room. Frank looked at me when he sat down. I looked back. I gave him nothing. The proceeding was not a trial in the dramatic sense. It was a hearing on the financial disclosure and the dissipation claims. But what happened in that room was, for our particular story, the decisive moment. Gerald Poole attempted to argue that HF Consulting, LLC, had been formed prior to the marriage deteriorating, and that the payments to Cindy Walters were repayment for professional services rendered. The claim being that she had done bookkeeping work for the LLC. Ellen placed Paula Stroud's forensic report in front of the judge. Paula had traced the payment schedule. The transfers had increased significantly in frequency and size, starting in the same month that Frank had begun coming home smelling of Cindy's apartment. She had also obtained, through proper channels, the record showing Cindy Walters had no formal business license, no registered business entity, and had filed no Schedule C income for any of the years in question. The judge, a woman of about 60 with very good posture and wire-rimmed glasses, looked at the report for a long moment. Then she looked at Gerald Poole and asked him to clarify the professional services claim. Gerald Poole clarified at some length. He was not a family law specialist, and it showed. He used language designed for contract disputes and corporate litigation, and it sat wrong in that room, like furniture from the wrong house. Frank, I noticed, had stopped looking at anyone directly. He was looking at the table in front of him with the expression of a man who has run out of the calculation he came in with. I felt, in that moment, something I had not permitted myself to feel since March, a clean, quiet, comprehensive calm. Not triumph, that would come later, and in a smaller, private form, just calm. The calm of having done the work, documented the facts. Let the truth sit in front of the right people. Ellen spoke for 11 minutes. She presented the dissipation total, the LLC documentation, the Vanguard account that had not been disclosed in Frank's initial financial declaration, and the record of Dennis's phone call, which, paired with Frank's subsequent proposal of a private settlement, Ellen characterized as a coordinated attempt to resolve the matter outside of court before the LLC records could be properly examined. Gerald Poole objected to the characterization. The judge noted the objection and continued reading Paula's report. The judge did not rule that day. That is not how these hearings work. But she issued an interim order. The Vanguard account was frozen pending full disclosure, and both parties were required to submit complete financial certifications within 10 business days. She also noted, on the record, that the pattern of transfers identified by Paula Stroud would be given significant weight in the final equitable distribution determination. After the hearing, in the hallway outside the courtroom, I watched Gerald Poole and Frank speak quietly near the far wall. Frank ran a hand over his face, a gesture I recognized, one he made when something had gone worse than he'd expected. Gerald Poole was doing the talking. Frank was standing very still, listening, in the posture of someone being told things they do not want to hear. Ellen touched my elbow. "Good day," she said quietly. It was. It genuinely was. The final settlement hearing was in September. Those 3 months between June and September were their own kind of endurance. Frank's team, after the June hearing, made 2 more attempts at private negotiation. Both relayed through Gerald Poole to Ellen, and both declined. Frank, I learned later from Rachel, had been staying with Dennis since May. He had told the children that we were working things out, a phrase that became increasingly hollow as the legal record accumulated. In August, Rachel called me on a Sunday evening. She'd spoken to her father. She asked me carefully whether there was any possibility of reconciliation. I sat with that question for a moment before I answered. Rachel was not asking it on Frank's behalf. I knew my daughter. She was asking it because she was 38 years old, and her parents' marriage had been a fixed point in her world for her entire life, and fixed points, when they move, create a specific kind of vertigo. "No, sweetheart," I said. "But I want you to know, I am not doing this in anger. I'm doing this because I know what is mine, and I know what is true." She was quiet. Then she said, "Okay, Mom, what do you need?" That was when I cried. Not for the marriage. I had done that privately, in increments, over the previous 5 months. I cried because my daughter had asked the right question, and it was the right question at the right time. The September hearing was different from June. Frank's attorneys had completed the financial certification, under court mandate, and the full picture was now visible to everyone in that room. The Vanguard account, $41,200. The LLC dissipation, $61,940 transferred to Cindy Walters. The pension, fully vested. The joint accounts. The house. Ellen had prepared a comprehensive marital estate valuation and a proposed distribution. Given the length of the marriage, my role as homemaker and primary caregiver for the early decades, my significantly lower earning history and Social Security projection, and, centrally, the dissipation finding, she was arguing for a distribution weighted substantially in my favor. Gerald Poole's counterproposal was modest adjustments. He was working, I could see, from a position of diminished leverage. The judge had read everything. She asked several precise questions of both attorneys, of Frank directly at one point, and once of me. She asked me whether I had been aware of the HF Consulting LLC during the marriage. No, I said, I was not. She looked at me for a moment over her glasses. Then she moved on. Her ruling, issued 12 days later in a written decision I read at Carol's kitchen table with a cup of tea, was thorough and unambiguous. The marital home in Maplewood was awarded to me. I could sell it, remain in it, or transfer it. It was mine. Frank was to receive his equity share in a cash payment, calculated from the marital estate. The joint savings, $231,000, were split 60% to me, 40% to Frank. The Vanguard account, the hidden one, was included in the marital estate and distributed accordingly. The dissipated $61,940 was factored into Frank's share as a deduction. He had already spent the money. The court treated it as having come out of his portion. The pension was to be divided through a qualified domestic relations order, giving me a share calculated from our years of marriage. In total, after the attorney's fees were settled, I walked away from 31 years of marriage. I mean from the legal dissolution of it, which took a calendar year from the first signs to the final order. With the house, a substantial portion of our savings, a pension share, and something I had not expected to feel as strongly as I did, the complete, verified knowledge that I had not been outmaneuvered. Frank's attorney filed a notice of appeal on 2 minor valuation points. Ellen told me appeals of this kind rarely succeeded and that neither point affected the core distribution. She was right. The appeal was withdrawn 4 months later. Frank signed the final order in a lawyer's office in Morristown on a Tuesday afternoon in October. I was not there. I was at the library, running my usual Wednesday. No, wait. That Tuesday, I was at the library for a special children's reading hour we'd organized for fall. I was reading Where the Wild Things Are to a group of 6-year-olds when my phone buzzed quietly in my pocket. Ellen's text. It's done. Congratulations, Dorothy. I finished the book. The children clapped. I smiled at them genuinely with my whole face. Then I stepped into the hallway and let myself feel, for exactly 60 seconds, the full and private weight of what was over. Then I went back in for the next story. I stayed in the house on Maplewood for 6 more months after the settlement. Then I sold it. This surprised people. Carol, my children, a few friends who assumed the house was the prize I'd been fighting for. But the truth was, I'd been fighting for what it represented, my right to decide. And once that right was established and confirmed and signed, I found that what I actually wanted was not the colonial with the crooked mailbox. What I wanted was something I'd never had entirely to myself, something new. I bought a condominium in Montclair, 3rd floor, south-facing, with windows that filled the living room with afternoon light. It had a small balcony where I put planters immediately. Basil, rosemary, 1 tomato that didn't thrive but tried hard. I bought furniture I chose entirely alone for the first time in my life, and I discovered I had very specific opinions about furniture. Rachel came to help me move in. Michael drove up from Maryland with his truck. Susan, who had taken the divorce hardest, arrived on the second day with a bottle of champagne. We sat on the floor of the empty living room and she said, "I'm proud of you, Mom." I told her it was exactly the right thing to say. I started a new volunteer role at the Montclair Public Library and joined a book club that read more fiction than my old one had. I found I'd been missing fiction without knowing it. Carol drove up on occasional weekends. Linda sent me a card when I moved in. "You did it, Dorothy. Now go live." I was 65 years old in my new apartment, and I was, in a way I found difficult to articulate but deeply recognized, happy. Not the absence of pain kind, the present and chosen kind. Carol and I went to Portugal in the spring. In Lisbon, we walked wherever we wanted, at whatever pace we chose, and ate dinner at 10 o'clock because we felt like it. I bought a blue ceramic tile at a market for no reason, except that it was beautiful. It sits on my kitchen windowsill still. As for Frank, I heard things, the way you do, through the children and through the small telegraph of a community where people have known each other for decades. Frank and Cindy had moved in together. The relationship did not appear to be going well. By the following year, they had separated. The reasons seemed to involve, with some irony, financial disagreements. Frank's post-settlement finances were considerably leaner than Cindy had apparently expected, and she had found that reality less compelling than the version she'd known before. Dennis had been cut off by his own wife, Barbara, after it emerged that he'd made that intimidating phone call, the one Ellen had documented and presented in court. Barbara had always been kind to me at family gatherings. I was not surprised. I did not follow any of this closely. What I felt was not satisfaction, exactly, more like confirmation, that the truth, properly documented and placed before the right people, has consequences. That you cannot quietly drain a marriage's assets into a secret life and walk away without those facts mattering. They had mattered. On the first anniversary of moving into the Montclair apartment, I sat on my balcony in the early evening light and thought about the woman who had stood in her kitchen holding a red lipstick, watching 42 years quietly collapse. She did all right, I thought. She did better than all right. They say the best revenge is a life well lived. I don't think of it as revenge. I think of it as accounting, knowing what is yours, documenting what is true, and refusing to sign away either one at someone else's kitchen table. I was 64 years old and I started over. Not because I was brave, because I was clear. If that red lipstick had rolled across your floor, what would you have done? Leave your answer in the comments. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And thank you, truly, for listening.